The topic on the syllabus for today says something like the individual and society, but we have some preliminary ideas and concepts that we need to sort out. So let's begin with that. This is a broadly speaking, this is a course in on the American political system, American politics. Even though this course is called Federal Government, I think I might have mentioned to you all in the last class meeting that it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's misnamed. Actually, let me digress on that point here for just a second. What does that title, that course, Federal Government, when you hear those words, Federal Government, what does that mean to you? Right? Anybody want to tell us what the federal government is? Okay. It's what?
Central government.
Central government. Okay. Anything else?
The highest one of government.
The highest. You said the highest one of government? Okay. Okay, that's interesting. What else? Anything? One of the things, if you kind of know how the English language works and what the function of nouns and adjectives is, right? What is the in that concept, federal government? What's the noun? Government, right? No, the noun is government, right? Yeah, and the adjective is federal, right? And what do adjectives do? They modify or describe. So one of the things that you can sort of infer from that, just based on your knowledge of how the English language works, is that it's not the only government. This course is not called Government 2305, the government. Okay? What do you mean, Fagan? Well, in other words, I think you have some intuition about this, that you may be aware that we have multiple governments in our system. Okay? So which government is it that people are thinking of or contemplating when they say or use the term federal government? Somebody says, what is your first name? Says it's the highest one. What exactly? You're imagining some sort of hierarchy of government, right? Where up at the top you've got the federal government, and then under that you've got what? State government, and under that you've got city governments and county governments and school district governments. A lot of people do have that concept of our system, that there's a hierarchy. That's really not necessarily accurate to think of it that way, that there's somehow certainly not in a legalistic or constitutional sense, there's not a hierarchy, right? Even so, I think you probably have a lot of people probably think about it that way, that somehow the federal government, so-called federal government, is at the top, and then state and then local governments sort of under that. But if that suggests, what I'm cautioning about, if you're thinking that suggests some sort of flow of power, or if you mean by hierarchy, that's some sort of command structure, the so-called federal government, or people call it the federal government, doesn't really have the ability legally or constitutionally to command state and local governments to do certain things. That's not the way our system works. So we'll actually have an opportunity to develop that idea later on in the semester, not too far down the road. Several weeks down the road, we'll sort of get into that in more detail. That word federal actually is misleading. Again, as I said last time, nobody asked me when they decided to name this course Government 2305. If they had, I would have said, no, don't name it federal government. Okay? That word federal, many people associate with the government in Washington. Right? The federal government, that's the government in Washington, which may have like operations other places across the country, it's a branch operation, so to speak, across the country. But everybody seems to have the sense that the federal government is in Washington. Well, I think that's a misnomer to call that the federal government, even though historically Americans have done that. I mean, it's not anything new. Historically, Americans have called that the federal government. The word federal actually means all of those, right? It means national. I would call the government of Washington the national government, right? So we have the national government, we have the 50 state governments, and then we have the literally tens of thousands of local governments, city governments, county governments, municipal governments all across the country. That's the federal system. All of that is the federal system. Even though people persist in thinking about, when they hear the word federal, we use the word federal strictly in association with Washington. Right? So I would say, the first thing I would say to the namers of the course is, well, don't call it federal. If you're going to call it anything along those lines, call it national government, right? And then when people take the Government 2306 course, they can take state and local government. And together, 2305 and 2306, they have a more complete picture of our federal system of government. of it that I never have liked is the use of the word government. Right? I wouldn't call this course the national government either, because of my objection to the use of the word government. The word government, what does that conjure up when you hear that? Or use that? What are you thinking of? What? Authority, okay? Just broadly speaking, authority, okay? Anything else? You do, though, what's your first name? You do recognize that authority lies elsewhere other than government, right? For example, it depends on maybe the type of authority you're talking about or the application of authority that you're talking about. For example, is there authority in private corporations? Sure. Is there authority in religious institutions? Colleges and universities? But those aren't really what we call government, right? You understand what I'm saying? That the word, I'm not suggesting to you that government doesn't have some implication of authority. I'm just suggesting to you that the word authority and government, authority can't be associated exclusively with government. There is authority that we recognize in all sorts of institutional arrangements.
So, maybe providing regulations so that only government can enforce any kind of business or market.
Okay, now you're sort of getting to something that I really want us to be talking about a little bit, but let me just push that back for a couple of minutes here, just to make sure everybody's clear on my objection to the use of the word government in the context of just naming this course, right? What I'm trying to say is that when most people think of the word government, they're thinking about these institutional arrangements, and some of you might even get like vivid visual imagery in mind. Right? Like some people might imagine the Capitol building in Washington with the dome and in the House chamber and the Senate chamber with all the representatives and senators debating and passing important legislation. And some people might imagine the White House or the Supreme Court building, the actual architecture of the buildings, right? But then maybe also the people who occupy those positions of governmental authority, right? And how they operate, the roles and responsibilities and actions that they undertake and so on. And all of that's correct. When people think about the national government, think about the president and the Congress, the branches of government, right? And maybe even the bureaucracies and so on, like the Social Security Administration and the Department of Defense. Everybody recognizes that's all government, right? What I'm trying to tell you is that this course is broader than that. If you looked at that course syllabus and you examined those topics that we're covering this semester, you saw topics on the syllabus dealing with American national government. There's a topic on there, a separate topic on the United States Congress, a separate topic on the United States presidency, a separate topic on the so-called federal bureaucracies, a separate topic on the court system, the national court system, although all that comes really pretty much at the end of the semester. So what are we doing with the, 12 weeks before we get to all that sort of stuff? Oh, we're talking about aspects of the American political system that are not government. You see what I'm saying? That this course, we need a term. If they were asking me to name this course, I'd say, well, we need a term that captures the breadth of this course. It's not just about government. It's about the American political system more generally. The concept of the political system is broader than the concept of government. And most people recognize that the activities and the behaviors that occur within government institutions might be fairly characterized as political in most instances, but you can probably also appreciate that political activities and political behaviors occur outside of government institutions. We have, within the American political system, we have organizations called political parties, for example. That's not government. Political parties are not governmental institutions. Okay? We have interest groups. Those are not governmental institutions. We have individuals who engage in political behavior. They are not institutional, governments, right? But even outside of, the concept of politics and government together, many of you can probably appreciate that politics occurs in other kinds or relative to other kinds of institutions as well. Does it not? There's politics in government, to be sure, in and around government, but there's also politics in private corporations, and there's politics in churches and religious institutions, and there's politics in universities and colleges, right? There's politics in Little League Baseball. Have you ever been associated with youth baseball? Many years when my son was little, I was heavily involved in youth baseball. And trust me, there's politics in youth baseball. Okay. Someone once wrote a song a long time ago called "The Politics of Dancing" or dating or something like that, right? So what do we mean by politics? Well, bear in mind that politics has application to all sorts of human endeavors. We want to think about it specifically as it might relate to this course. So I want to start with not one, and not two, and not even three, not even just two, but three definitions of politics. The first is the classic definition that was offered by the eminent political scientist Harold Laswell way back in the 1940s, who wrote a book, and it was an instant classic, I suppose, among political scientists. And the way that he defined or described or discussed politics really has become the standard. And it appears in every introductory American government textbook that I have ever seen. I've seen a lot of them over the years. And the publishers send me their textbooks and say, "Oh, will you adopt our textbook? It's so superior to all the competition." Well, they all have Laswell's definition of it, including the textbook that we're using in this course. Laswell defined politics as who gets what, when, and how. And I have modified it ever so slightly here by inserting in the brackets the process of determining. I don't think Laswell would mind that modification. I think that's exactly what he's talking about. Politics is the process of determining who gets what, when, and how. That definition is great in one respect because it's very, very easy for students to commit to memory. They have no problems, in my experience, remembering Laswell's definition, who gets what, when, and how. On the other hand, the problem is that it is sort of cliche. It's been used so much, it's been repeated so many times, it sort of sounds like a bumper sticker. It's easy to remember, but like lots of cliche sort of expressions, they lose their meaning over time, particularly. And I think a lot of students, when they're exposed to Laswell's definition, they say, "Oh, that's fine, no problem remembering that," but what is he talking about? Okay. To help us out with that, we're going to appeal to a second authority, intellectual authority, in this case, a political scientist by the name of David Easton, who comes along about 20 years later. It'll lock behind you. You won't be able to get back in.
No, someone outside.
No, you can't let him in. Okay, great. Thank you, though. David Easton comes along in the 1960s, and he defines politics as there's that word authoritative, right? He defines politics as the authoritative allocation of values. Please, you can't open the door. I'm telling you, it's a security issue, okay? I understand, and I feel bad that there's somebody out there.
He said it's not for the class. He says that he had a question about something.
You just have to wait till the end of the class session, okay? So David Easton comes along and he says that politics is the authoritative allocation of values. And again, I have modified Easton's definition slightly. I don't think that Easton would mind. I do this because I think when many people see this word values or encounter this word values, they tend to think in these sort of abstract terms, like these nebulous concepts, maybe like, honesty and integrity and, responsibility or whatever personal values, maybe even moral values or religious values or cultural values, as we use the term values in that context, traditional values or new values, new age values. However people think about that concept, it's very vague, it's very abstract. While I think Easton may say, well, yeah, but what he really wants us to think in more material terms, more concrete terms. So just by changing that a little bit, it tempts us to do that. Politics is the authoritative allocation of valued things. Valued by whom? Well, the members of society, whatever given society it is that we're talking about. What sorts of things do they value? Oh, we could actually make a list. We could start making a list. Okay? And I think we would find that some of the things that we would put on this list would be pretty universal, whether we're talking about American society or whether we're talking about Japanese society or Russian society or Venezuelan society, whatever particular civil society we're talking about. There would be some things on that list that would be pretty universal, right? What's one thing, very maybe obvious thing, that people generally value? Time. Okay, yeah, that's true. Time. That's absolutely right. Okay. Money. Okay. You mean like currency? Like maybe, but maybe more broadly, wealth. I like to maybe put it in terms of wealth. Boy, I think Easton would probably encourage us to start with that. Okay. There are other things that we could put on the list, right? You got one?
Yeah, people value security.
Okay, security. Okay.
Like resources.
Okay. We might try to get you to be a little bit more specific, like what kinds of research.
Yeah.
Okay, like economic goods.
Like trading goods. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Taxes.
Taxes are a value.
I mean, yeah, for the government.
Well, we're just talking about people, like ordinary people in society, right? Like what kinds of things do we value? Okay. We might put that aside, at least just for the time being. And I think in the abstract way that I was talking about values a couple of minutes ago, yes, but in the way that we're talking about here in terms of concrete material things, right? Education, healthcare, clean air, clean water. You see what I'm saying? We could probably spend the rest of the day developing a very long list of things that people in American society value. Now, can we take any one of if Easton is right, we should be able to take any one of those things that we just mentioned in that list that we're developing and plug it in here and it would make sense. Politics is the authoritative allocation of wealth. Is that true? Does the distribution of wealth, what do we mean by allocation? This term right here corresponds to what part of Laswell's definition? The determination of who gets it, right? The authoritative allocation or the authoritative determination of who gets wealth. Is that ever the subject of politics? For example, we have politicians out there who run a campaign for office or some sort of political agenda that is motivated largely by their concerns about the distribution of who gets wealth.
So
of course we do, right?
Like an example would be how Donald Trump's trying to get money for the wall and stuff.
Well, again, specific programs or policies, as we might refer to them, are going to plug in here, but I'm trying to get you to think just initially about something that everybody seems to value, right? Everybody values wealth. Some people seem to value it more than others, but generally in our society, wealth is something that is valued. Okay? And from there, we can go to say something like education. Is education something that is valued? Is education something that has to be allocated, where determination has to be made about who gets it, when they get it, and how they get it? How about clean air and clean water? How about that one? How about clean air? Is air a thing of value? Okay, sure it is. Right? Have any of you taken an economics course? Does air have to be allocated? Who's taking an economics course? Okay. Economists will sometimes, sort of, to get people thinking about this sort of stuff, they'll distinguish between a free good and an economic good. Okay? A free good, they'll say, is something that is really doesn't have to be allocated. Obviously, it's just there to be appropriated. Okay? Is air like that, or is it in a sense an economic good that it has to be allocated? I'm using that deliberately as an example because that's the thing that people almost always come up with when an economist asks them for an example of a free good. But most economists are quick to point out that it's only a free good. Free goods, let's take an economic good. An economic good is something that has alternative uses. Right? So the question then becomes, well, does air have alternative uses? Sure it does. We can use it to breathe and sustain life, or we can use it for storage space, for toxic pollutants. Right? And the more we use the air for storage space for toxic pollutants, the less breathable air we have. Now, my question for you is, does the question about the allocation of air, or at least clean air, ever become the subject of political debate and political discussion? Of course. Right? Who gets clean air, when they get it, how they get it. Not everybody gets equal amounts of clean air. All you have to do is drive down I-10 a little ways over to the Deer Park, Pasadena area, and you begin to get a very clear, and actually even out here in this area, air quality is not as good as it is if you drive out, say, to, further west, right? So, even air, or at least clean air and clean water and so on, are matters. These are things of value and they have to be allocated. A determination has to be made about who gets them. Look, here's the bottom line. So we can move on to other stuff. The things that we value in our society are valued precisely because of the fact of scarcity. If they're in abundance, infinite abundance, there's no reason for politics, right? But if they are scarce, as all of the things that we've mentioned, that you all mentioned and we put on that list are, then they're scarce. Not everybody can have as much as they want. Not everybody can have as much wealth as they want. Okay? Some people are going to get more wealth, some people are going to get less wealth. Right? Not everybody can have as much education as they want. Some people are going to get more education, some people are going to get less education. Not everybody can have as much clean air or clean water or any of these other things. Okay? That means that they're scarce and they have to be allocated. Okay? So when Laswell says the process of determining who gets what, he's talking about the valued things that Easton is referring to here, and the process of determining, or the process of determining who gets it is the allocation. Right? So what I'm telling you is that Easton and Laswell are essentially saying the same thing. Right? While Laswell's definition is pretty easy to commit to memory, and I think this is pretty easy to commit to memory as well, Laswell's definition is kind of cliche, loses its meaning. We want further explanation. Laswell's Easton's definition is kind of jargonistic. We have to sort of define the terms that are part of the definition. What does he mean by authoritative? What does he mean by allocation? What does he mean by values? Right? But easy enough to remember. Right? So that's why I offered the third definition, which is my definition. And I don't offer you this definition because I'm trying to suggest to you in any way that my definition is better than Easton's or better than Laswell's. Okay? But it does say, with a little bit more precision, what we can only infer from Laswell and Easton's definition. Okay? So here's my definition, and you need to know all three of these. Right? My definition of politics is that politics is the competitive process engaged in a society to allocate scarce resources and determine, you can't see it because that little thing's blocked off down there at the bottom, it says determine priorities. Okay. Politics is the competitive process engaged in a society to allocate scarce resources and determine priorities. And as I say, this definition says with a little more precision what we can infer from these others. First of all, the reason that we have politics is because the things that we value in society are scarce. It's the fact of scarcity. Oh, let me appeal to an example that I like to use frequently to sort of illustrate this point. If it's just not crystal clear to you yet, let me digress for a moment and try to drive this point home. I would like for you to imagine some primitive tribal society on some remote island in the Pacific, undiscovered or unknown to the rest of the world. They live this very isolated existence. Nobody knows about them. They don't know about anybody else. Right? they have one thing in this community, in this tribal community, that they value. Use your imagination, make it whatever it is. And they keep it in a big pit in the ground. And every day, at sunup, the members of this island tribal society are permitted to line up, queue up, as our British friends say, right? And by the way, they observe the queue, right? As our British friends insist that we observe the queue, right? And when their time comes, they come to the front of the line, they're permitted to dip in and take out as much of this thing from the pit as they want, take it back to their individual family huts, and consume it until they're satiated. And they do this every day, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, etc., right? At some point, what do you predict that they're likely to discover? That it is, in fact, not unlimited, that there is some scarcity, right? And by the way, that's when the pushing and shoving in life begins, right? That's when people try to take cuts in the queue, right? That's when maybe the bigger, stronger, physically bigger, stronger members of society force their way up to the front and take as much as they can possibly take and leave scarcely little for everyone else, right? They have developed a process for allocating this thing that we might describe as the law of the jungle. It's the law of the jungle and the survival of the fittest. They're going to go in and get as much as they possibly want, whatever's left for everybody else, too bad. Right? Or maybe the elders of the community, having more evolved sensibilities, more civilized notions of equity and rule of law and so on, maybe they develop a more democratic process where all of the members of the community can have enough to sustain their basic needs, right? Maybe that is more consistent with the concept of rule of law. And we're going to have a process here. We're going to have an orderly process here. It's not going to be the law of the jungle. It's going to be the rule of law. So those are two extremes, two opposite ends of the extreme. You can probably appreciate that there are all sorts of alternatives in between those two, but whether it is the sort of law of the jungle model that I'm suggesting to you, or whether it is the rule of law model that I'm suggesting to you on the other end, or one of those alternatives in between, we can call any of those alternatives the political process. That's politics. Okay? And sometimes we attach labels when we're talking about actual real-world societies. We attach labels to the political process. We say that's a democratic political process, or that's an authoritarian political process, or that's a totalitarian political process. Okay? There are all sorts of labels we like to throw in there: liberal and socialist, and all sorts of things that people use that supposedly have meaning to those who use them and to those that hear them. And we'll have plenty of opportunity, I think, this semester to try to sort out maybe what some of those labels mean. But for now, all I'm really trying to press upon you is that whatever adjective we put in front of the word politics, whether it's democratic or authoritarian or whatever, it's politics, right? And it's unavoidable, it's inescapable, at least in human societies. Many Americans don't have much affection for politics. I don't like politics. I hate politics. Why do we even have to have politics? Well, like it or not, you just have to accept that it's a reality. When we all die and go to our heavenly rewards, there will be no need for politics. Okay? But in earthly human society, the things that we value are scarce and they have to be allocated. Okay? So politics is inescapable. All right, questions about that? So again, my definition suggests it's all about the scarcity of resources, but it also says that it's the competitive process. And I was kind of hinting at that when I was talking about Laswell and Easton, right? In other words, politics is a process that's going to result in winners and losers. Again, like it or not. If you have sort of this idealistic notion that what should happen in politics is what's good for everybody, well, grow up, right? If somebody can ever tell me and identify with some specificity for me what's good for everybody, I'm happy to listen. Beyond some very broad, very vague notions like, well, the country ought to be at peace and and be prosperous. Maybe we can get close to unanimity on that, but that unanimity breaks down very, very quickly when you start talking about how. How are you going to maintain the peace? How are you going to promote prosperity? You don't get anywhere close to unanimity. In fact, it appears in modern American politics in the early 21st century that we can't even get consensus most of the time. So, yeah, I mean, in some ways, I guess the idealistic part of me, whatever of it remains, hasn't been completely snuffed out by the realities of life. Would like to think that we could have a process where everybody could get together and agree and everybody would be happy, but I don't think that's reasonable. I don't think it's realistic. So it does produce winners and losers. Now, I don't think we have to think about it in terms of absolute winners and absolute losers. I don't think politics is necessarily a zero-sum game. Have any of you ever heard that concept before? Where the sum of all the winners' winnings is equal to the sum of all the losers' losses, right? I don't think we have to think about it in that way, okay? I don't think politics is necessarily a zero-sum game where somebody wins absolutely everything and others win absolutely nothing, okay? But I think we should think about it in terms of relative winners and relative losers. Some people get relatively more wealth. Some people get relatively less wealth. Some people get relatively more education. Some people get relatively less education, as I said a little bit earlier. Okay, so politics is a process. It's competitive. It produces relative winners and losers. All right, and then the last thing that my definition says, which is, again, is kind of cut off here at the bottom, is that the way that a society allocates its scarce resources really tells us something about its priorities, doesn't it? We can sort of look at how a society where, and we have to kind of do this in a comparative context, I think, but if in society A, things of value are distributed more evenly across the members of society, in society B, things are more concentrated with a very well-defined elite at the top that have virtually everything and everybody else has virtually nothing, that would probably tell us something about the priorities of that society, right? And that were maybe where we would get tempted to start putting labels on things. Like this is a X kind of politics, the X kind of political system. This is a Y kind of political system. All of that is stuff to look forward to that we'll talk about later. Okay? Questions about that? The second basic concept that we should probably talk about here at the beginning is the concept of government, and we can do this one a little bit more quickly. I only have one definition for you. I like to define government as the structured arrangements in a society that produces and enforces decisions that resolve conflicts over scarce resources. Government refers to the structured arrangements in a society that produces and enforces decisions resolving conflicts over scarce resources. A lot of textbooks, by the way, here's one of those times this semester when you're going to notice that I have a way of talking about a concept that differs somewhat from the authors of your textbook. You're not going to find this verbiage in the textbook. They give you some kind of definition of government, but it's not this. Okay? I'm not telling you that theirs is wrong and mine's right, and I don't think they would say that mine's wrong and theirs is right. Okay? But I think this definition gets us a little bit further down the road in understanding how government operates in American political society. A lot of textbooks will define government simply as the legitimate use of force. I've seen that one in so many textbooks. Government is the legitimate use of force. And I think for many of you, your intuition probably would tell you that that's correct. For example, if I was to ask you, why do you pay your taxes? What would your answer be? Why? Because it's right? So what? It's required. What if you don't?
Then I get thrown in jail.
You're going to get punished. Well, we don't send too many people to prison anymore for tax evasion. It usually is a matter of financial penalties, but maybe if you're involved in organized crime or something like that, and you're like an Al Capone type or something, and they want to put you away for your illegal activities, and all they can get you on is tax evasion, and maybe that's what they do. That's what Capone went to prison for, right? But more generally, you're on the right track, right? But you're saying you pay your taxes because you know if you don't, there's going to be a punishment associated with it, right? Why do you obey the speed limit? Maybe you are maybe you're a person that has a concept of the world around you that just isn't your little world, right? That you have some appreciation for the fact that your behavior affects other people, and you reason it out. Oh, you know what? It probably is better, all other things on balance, for me to maintain a speed that is not dangerous because there are other people out here on the road and I might hurt them, or I might get hurt too, right? But probably, I think that's part of many people's thinking, but is there anything else? Any other reasons why people obey the speed limit? What? Hold on for just a second, okay? What? Well, yes, again, you're thinking about ultimately the consequences of maintaining safe speed. All I'm really trying to get you to say is it not because you're worried about getting pulled over by a cop and getting a ticket? Okay? So there's a punishment associated with it? Okay, so look, let me finish up this point here real quick, okay? There is an aspect of government that is coercive, right? Where if you don't conform to the requirements and the expectations that government has imposed, that the consequences that you're going to be punished with. But that really just shifts the burden of definition. Because the next thing I'm going to ask you and get you to consider, and maybe we can start with this next time, is why do you accept the punishments as legitimate? If we really thought that government didn't have the authority to impose a tax on us or to control our behavior when we get behind the wheel of the car, then we also wouldn't accept the legitimacy of government to punish us when we defy it. We would be like Henry David Thoreau. We would go to jail in order to articulate that principle. Okay. Anyway, we're out of time. We'll finish up with that next time.